Alright, good afternoon. Sorry, I am traveling with my family right now, so the only place that I could quietly and undisturbingly do this video was in the bathroom, so that explains why there's a shower behind me. So to begin, my first chosen prompt discusses the distinction between killing and letting die, and it sort of brings in Rachel's objections and Solmazzi's articulation between the two, and so yeah, we're going to talk about that one first. So in the past, patients and their families were not given the decision of withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining treatment. Once modern medical practices and technology permitted prolonging life, the ethical value of essentially killing a patient or letting them die has never actually been decided. The traditional view was brought into the argument by providing a logical argument of morally justifying withdrawing care, even if that results in death. The principles of the traditional view state that obviously all killing is wrong. However, allowing patients to die with consent is actually morally permissible. Sorry, got a sore throat. The traditional view also says that withholding and withdrawing care are actually means of letting a patient die and not actively killing the individual, hence making both actions morally permissible. Currently, patients have the right to refuse life-sustaining treatment, which leaves the decision in the hands of the patient and not in the hands of a family member or the healthcare provider to make. Rachel's objections critique the traditional view and provide a solid ground against the moral distinction of killing and letting someone die. Rachel's claims that in some cases actively killing a person is more humane because subjectively this is true, considering that actively killing someone may be more humane in terms of the patient's suffering, but isn't actually ethically sound in terms of medical care and that type of thing. Rachel's makes a valid point by stating withdrawing care does not mean that the patient will die immediately, but that the patient has more freedom to die peacefully in their own time and on their own will. He made these objections based on compassion to highlight that letting a patient die, as opposed to physician-assisted suicide, runs counter to the concerns of regarding death with dignity. In addition, Rachel's claims that life and death are decided on irrelevant grounds, meaning that life and death don't exactly happen at an exact moment in time. Death is more of an ongoing process that can't really be determined from like this set point on. He uses this explanation to prove that there cannot be an exact time to withdraw or withhold care, that it's more, if it's a process, you can't just say, okay, on this day you're going to withdraw all this treatment and then this is when it's going to begin. So, moving on to Solmazzi's articulation between the two states, I guess. Solmazzi disagrees with Rachel's by saying that you can't actually articulate between the two. He claims that the definition of letting die is an act in which an agent either performs an action to remove an intervention that forestalls a pre-existing fatal condition, or refrains from an action that would forestall a pre-existing fatal condition, either with the specific intention of acting that this person would die by way of the act or not so intending. Solmazzi also states that all killing is indeed wrong. He also says some letting die is wrong and some is permissible. So those guidelines aren't very clear on just that statement. But he goes on to say that the intentions of doing so is what the key moral determinant is. What Solmazzi is actually trying to get across is that the intentions of the physician, case by case, is going to determine what is wrong and what is right. So that concludes the first prompt. The second prompt that I chose was the one on voluntary euthanasia. Also, sorry for any mispronunciations on any of these words. So yeah, that prompt obviously asks to discuss the ethical permissibility of voluntary euthanasia, describe what it is, and then 3 arguments in support and in opposition of that whole process. So I describe voluntary euthanasia as very similar to physician-assisted suicide, but there requires more involvement with the physician and the patient. It's not just like physician-assisted suicide is where, you know, the patient says, okay, I'm ready for this, and the physician gives means to do this whole process, but it's more of a co-bonded thing that happens together with both the physician and the patient. So continuing, the 4 types of euthanasia are active, voluntary, non-voluntary, and involuntary. To differentiate between the other types, voluntary euthanasia occurs when a patient explicitly and autonomously requests the procedure. So those 2 descriptive words really set voluntary away from the other 4 types, or the 3 types. Excuse me. The ethical permissibility of voluntary euthanasia can be debated in either direction. The first major argument that I pointed out in support of was that it focuses on compassion and suffering relief of the patient. So those who argue this position agree that the quality of life of the patient is more important than the desire to preserve his or her life at any cost. So essentially, properly taking advantage of this process is said to minimize needless suffering, which clearly gives, you know, enough reason to make this side of the argument legitimate. It kind of just states like, well, if they're not, you know, having a great quality of life, then what's the point of them continuously suffering, which, you know, I understand. The second argument in support of voluntary euthanasia that I wanted to point out was the focus on autonomy, preservation, and the right to self-determination. So, those who argue this position claim that patients should be able to make their own decisions regarding his or her life and death, and should not be forced to endure suffering against their own will. So, the death with dignity argument ultimately concludes by saying that it's an autonomous choice, even if it ends up in death, and regardless of that autonomous choice, that it has to be respected. So again, like, you know, if they're suffering, if it's their choice to do so, then it has to be respected by others. We can't just force, you know, someone to just sit there and be miserable for the rest of their however long this life is going to be. So, the third major argument that I wanted to focus on was the physician's autonomy. So this one was pulled from Thomas's, however you say that, his article. And he really made it clear that respecting the patient's autonomy is obviously important to the whole process. I mean, it's affecting them directly. But he states that the physician also has to be 100% comfortable in their involvement and what their intentions are in the process. It's not just like a passive, okay, yeah, I'm doing this for my patient. Like, it has to be a mutual agreement that this is going to be okay. So, it said that the request must be thoroughly evaluated and accepted before the physician can grant permission for completion of the procedure. It also makes clear that if the physician is in any way not comfortable, that he or she has full right to say, no, we're not doing this, we're not going to continue with this, you know, I'm not comfortable with doing this, so you can seek this procedure by someone else. So it's just, again, it's just a balancing thing. Transitioning into the opposition arguments, Thomas also gave several clear reasons as to why, like, certain people see this, you know, going against the voluntary euthanasia. So the first argument in opposition that I wanted to point out was directed around the idea of slippery slope. So this one really made sense to me and the fact that understanding that many people do fear that the legalization of physician-assisted suicide will essentially lead to involuntary active, which isn't necessarily the same as voluntary active. But anyway, the whole point is that they're worried that one thing will lead to another, and hopeless people, or not hopeless, innocent people would lose their lives against their will because of their condition of living or whatever. So just put this into perspective for the disability community, for example. To them, their living of, their quality of life is great, everything's fine, but like to others that might seem not as desirable. So they're saying the slippery slope of this being legalized would end up to like all the undesirables being killed off, and as if that would actually never happen. I hope that would never happen, but they're just like considering the extremes of this process. So the second major argument in opposition is the claim that carrying out the procedures is contrary to the practice of medicine. So essentially, physicians take an oath before they receive their medical license to always induce healing rather than death. That's kind of a given. If you're practicing medicine, you want to better others and you want to see a progression in your patients, and that's mainly true, but we can all think of circumstances where it's just easier on the patient, and just the whole process of medical cost and yada yada yada, that voluntary euthanization would be more legitimate. But again, this side of the argument is saying that physicians are not made to do that. That is not part of their job. They chose to keep liveliness in their patients in all circumstances, which I can understand. So the final opposing argument that was actually made directly by Thomasma, he states that the doctor-patient relationship itself depends on trust, and if the public begins to distrust the medical profession, then the profession itself will suffer irreparable harm. So essentially what he's saying is that the physician makes all these decisions alongside of the patient and maybe the patient's family, and everything's great, but as soon as that trust between those two parties is gone or violated, then the whole medical profession itself is going to suffer those repercussions. So again, understandable, but like Thomas has said, like if that trust is violated, then the outcomes are not promising. So yeah, that pretty much sums up the prompt. Sounds good. Thank you.